So let's continue with chapter 3. Now, before we really get into doing the journal entries and the calculations, we need to have a discussion about what's called equivalent units of production. So think of it like this. We get to the end of the period, whether that's the end of the month, the end of the quarter, the end of the year, and we have some goods that are still in a stage of completion. They are not fully complete, but we've already started to work on them. So they're in on our conveyor belt, traveling through the factory, being worked on. It's the end of the month, quarter, year, and we need to determine what the value of those partially completed goods are. So the way we do it is we use a method called equivalent units of production. And so if we say, for example, that we have 10,000 units on this conveyor belt and they're about 50% of the way through, then 10,000 units that are 50% of the way through would be equivalent to about 5,000 units. So it's an estimate. It's not an exact science. It's an estimate, but it's a pretty good estimate because we know how much 5,000 units should cost, and that's the value that we can use on our balance sheet when we record the balance of the work in process inventory account. So when we talk about equivalent units of production, we're going to look at equivalent units of production for materials and then for conversion costs. Now remember, we learned in chapter 1 that conversion costs are direct labor plus overhead. Now oftentimes we'll find that materials, labor, and overhead, or materials and conversion cost, are occurred at different times. So while we may say these goods are halfway through the production process, they may have all of their materials already. So they may have 100% of the materials, but they're only halfway through with respect to labor and overhead. Or maybe they're halfway through with respect to labor and overhead, but they don't have any of the materials yet. So if we think about Puzzle Me, if we just think about the assembly department, the first step is to glue the picture to the cardboard. So then the puzzles in the assembly department will have all of the materials that they need, and they're just waiting on the glue to be pressed and the glue to dry. So they need more labor and overhead applied to them. When they get to the cutting department, the first thing you do is cut the puzzles, and then the last thing you do is put them in the box. So the materials are the last thing added. So if we said, well, they're halfway through that process, that means they're halfway through the labor and overhead process, but in that case, they wouldn't have any of their materials yet. So we'll usually have to compute two different equivalent units, one for materials and one for conversion cost. So we're told to assume that Puzzle Me has 40,000 units that the assembly department completed and transferred to the cutting department, to the next department. Now those 40,000 units had to be 100% complete, or we would not have transferred them to the next department. So those 40,000 units are equivalent to 40,000 units for both materials and conversion cost. If they weren't complete, we wouldn't have transferred them to the next department. But the 10,000 units in ending work in process, here we're told that they are 100% complete with respect to materials. So they have all the materials. They have the picture and the glue and the cardboard, but they're only 25% complete with respect to conversion cost. So now we need to compute the equivalent units of production for, again, both materials and conversion cost. So with respect to materials, 10,000 units that are 100% complete would be equivalent to 10,000 units. But for conversion cost, 10,000 units that are 25% complete would be equivalent to only 2,500 units. So while we have 10,000 puzzles in the assembly department, they're only equivalent to 2,500 puzzles with respect to conversion cost. So that's going to become really important, and we'll use that in the next objective as we get into that one and we actually start working through the problems in objective 3.